Okay, let's dive into a really fascinating and honestly a pretty radical idea from our source material today. It's a theory that looks at all the big problems in society. We're talking taxes, traffic, political scandals, you name it, and says, hey, what if these aren't separate issues at all? What if they're all connected by one single hidden cause? The author calls it the red thread. So let's pull on that thread together and see exactly where it leads. You know the feeling, right? You look at your paycheck and wonder where it all went, thanks to taxes. You hear stories about schools struggling. You sit in traffic that feels like it's never, ever going to move. These things are frustrating, they're part of our daily lives. But the source material we're digging into today asks a really powerful question. What if these aren't just random, unrelated headaches? What if there's a common denominator, a single root cause that ties them all together? And believe me, the author's list of problems goes way beyond just those daily annoyances. We're talking about the huge, headline-grabbing crises, runaway inflation that makes everything more expensive, the looming threat of power shortages, pollution choking our environment, crime on our streets, and of course, the political scandals that just seem to chip away at our trust in everything. According to our source, these aren't just isolated events. No, they're all symptoms of a single, much, much deeper systemic problem. So, here's our game plan for unpacking this whole thing. First, we're going to walk through this catalog of crises. Then we'll get to the heart of it all, the red thread feces itself. After that, we'll follow that thread through two huge areas, government-enforced monopolies and the very fabric of our society. And we're going to wrap it all up with what the author presents as the ultimate proof, the Watergate scandal and the crisis of faith it left in its wake. All right, let's get right into that catalog of crises. The source makes a really bold claim right from the get-go. It says that when you look at the areas where society is failing most spectacularly, the places where things are really going off the rails, you find one constant. In every single one of these cases, the activity is either completely run by, or at the very least, heavily controlled by, the government. What's so interesting here is how the source frames all of these problems as essentially government monopolies. Let's break it down. High taxes? Well, the author argues that's a direct result of government's exclusive monopolistic power to tax. No one else can do it. Crime? It happens on government streets, it's handled by government police, and it's processed through government courts. A disastrous foreign policy like Vietnam? That's an exclusive power, a monopoly, of the federal government. The welfare system? Again, exclusively a government operation. The pattern the author wants us to see is that these massive failures are all happening in areas where the government has total monopolistic control. And this pattern, this idea of government control everywhere you look, well, that brings us right to the absolute core of the theory. The author uses this really powerful metaphor to connect all these seemingly separate problems. This is it. This is the central pillar that the entire argument is built on. And here it is, the big reveal. In this key quote from the source, we find in each and every case a red thread marking and uniting them all, the thread of government. That's the unifying idea right there. The source is saying that government is the one constant, the single factor that connects this whole seemingly random collection of societal problems. But what does it really mean to blame government itself? So the red thread thesis, when you boil it down, is this. It's the theory that government itself, its operations, its influence, its very structure, is the foundational cause of these failures. The argument is much deeper than just saying government is involved. It's proposing that there is something inherent in the nature of government that doesn't just fail to solve problems, but actually actively creates them. Okay, so how does the author even begin to support such a huge thesis? Well, the first line of evidence traces that red thread through the concept of monopoly. The argument is that so many of our most essential and, let's be honest, often most frustrating services are structured as compulsory monopolies, created and enforced by the government. Just look at the pattern the source lays out here. The postal service? A government monopoly, plain and simple. Poor telephone service back in the day? The result of a government-granted monopoly. Dealing with power and gas shortages, the source links that straight to government-created local monopolies where you have no other choice. And inflation? The author argues this is a direct result of the government's total compulsory monopoly over the money supply, an area where competition is literally illegal. In every single one of these cases, the failure is tied to a lack of choice that's enforced by the state. And this line of reasoning doesn't just stop with your utility bills. Nope. The source extends this exact same monopoly argument to two other massive sectors of our society: the media we consume every day and the military that's supposed to defend us. The claim is that the red thread of government control is just as strong and just as problematic in these areas too. So for media, the source argues it's heavily controlled. You have the government's FCC deciding who gets the privilege to operate radio and television channels. This leads the author to ask a pretty pointed question: how can true freedom of speech really exist under those conditions? And in the same way, the military-industrial complex is described as being a creature born entirely from federal spending. Think about it. The government decides what to buy, who gets the massive contracts, and ultimately, it subsidizes the entire system.
Okay, so now let's follow this thread from these big-picture monopolies right into the fabric of our daily lives. The source applies the exact same critical lens to the problems we see in our cities and our public institutions, arguing that the government's role here is just essential and, in their view, just as damaging.
This slide just perfectly illustrates how wide-ranging this argument is. Those traffic jams you hate, they happen on government-owned roads. Worried about water shortages? Well, the rivers are in the public domain, and the suppliers are government-run. Pollution? The government owns the rivers and runs the municipal sewage systems that are often identified as major polluters. The housing crisis? The source points the finger directly at a combination of government zoning laws, property taxes, and so-called urban renewal projects. The thread connecting all of these urban failures, the source claims, is government ownership and control. And the argument extends right into our classrooms. The source points out something we all know. Public schools, which were once revered, are now widely criticized from all sides. And what is their fundamental structure? They are government-owned, they are government-operated, and attendance is compelled by law. For the author, the perceived crisis in education isn't some big mystery. It's just another inevitable consequence of that same red thread of government control. And as evidence that the public is starting to catch on to these failures, the source points to a single, really powerful number from the 1970s: 1.2 million. That is how many voters in California signed a petition to drastically, radically slash property taxes. The source presents this not just as a simple tax revolt, but as a massive, grassroots rebellion against the government's exclusive monopoly on taxation. Now, what's really interesting here is that the source is fair. It acknowledges that other thinkers have seen these same failures. The famous economist John Kenneth Galbraith, for instance, he absolutely noted the poor performance of the public sector, but his solution was to give it more resources, more funding. Our source argues this completely, totally misses the point. The crucial question isn't about funding levels. It's whether there is something inherent in the very nature of government that causes it to fail, no matter how much money you throw at it. And this brings us to the final act, the author's ultimate piece of evidence for the red thread thesis, the smoking gun, if you will. An event that didn't just expose a crime, but that fundamentally shattered the nation's faith in the idea of government itself: Watergate. The author's claim here is absolute and incredibly stark. Watergate wasn't just a crime committed by some people who happened to be in government. It was a crime of government. Every single institution involved was an arm of the state. The president, his secret operatives, the FBI, the CIA. There was no outside actor here. It was, in the source's unforgettable words, a purely and totally governmental phenomenon. The fallout, as the source details it, was this catastrophic cascading chain reaction. First, it began with police-state tactics, burglaries, illegal surveillance used by the FBI and the CIA. This then escalated to systemic, organized crimes being committed by the president himself and his closest aides. This, in turn, led to a complete desanctifying of an office that was once held in almost sacred reverence. And the final devastating result? A shattered, and the author would argue, a well-justified lack of faith and trust in the entire system of government. And this historical contrast just brilliantly illustrates the lasting impact of the scandal. The source recalls a historian who, years earlier, had called the early opponents of the U.S. Constitution men of little faith because of their deep distrust of centralized government power. The author suggests that after Watergate, that kind of deep skepticism no longer seemed like a lack of faith. It just seemed like common sense. The scandal didn't just expose crimes. For millions of people, it validated a fundamental distrust of government itself. So, we followed this red thread all the way from our tax returns to traffic jams, from the post office to the Oval Office. We've seen the source's comprehensive and, yes, highly controversial theory that government isn't the solution to our problems, but is instead their fundamental cause.
And this leaves us with one final, very provocative question to think about. What does it mean for all of us if it's right?